The rain hammered against David's windshield like skeletal fingers tapping against glass, each drop carrying whispers of forgotten souls. What started as a simple drive home from his business meeting had transformed into a nightmare journey through nature's fury. The radio crackled with static-laden warnings about the worst storm to hit the region in decades, but David pressed on, unaware that some encounters on deserted roads are destined by forces far beyond mere coincidence. Little did he know that in the next few miles, he would pick up a passenger whose very existence would challenge everything he believed about life, death, and the thin veil that separates our world from whatever lies beyond. David Morrison gripped the steering wheel tighter as another flash of lightning split the sky, momentarily turning the world into a stark black and white photograph. The storm had come from nowhere, transforming what should have been a peaceful evening drive into a white-knuckle battle against the elements. His knuckles were white against the leather steering wheel, and his eyes strained to see beyond the wall of water cascading down his windshield. The wipers struggled against the deluge, creating a hypnotic rhythm that seemed to match his racing heartbeat. He had left the Henderson Industries meeting 3 hours ago, confident he could make it home before the weather turned. Now, as he navigated the winding mountain road that served as a shortcut through the wilderness, he began to question that decision. The radio had gone silent 20 minutes ago, leaving him alone with only the symphony of rain and thunder for company. Through the chaos of wind and rain, a figure emerged from the darkness ahead. David's heart lurched as his headlights caught a young woman standing on the shoulder of the road, her thumb extended in the universal gesture of a hitchhiker. She wore a simple white dress that clung to her slender frame, completely soaked through by the relentless downpour. Her dark hair hung in wet tendrils around her face, and even from a distance, David could see she was shivering violently. What kind of person would be out here, alone, in this weather? His rational mind screamed warnings about picking up strangers, especially on such an isolated stretch of road, but his conscience wouldn't allow him to leave someone stranded in this storm. As he slowed the car, another lightning flash revealed her face more clearly. She was beautiful in an otherworldly way, with pale skin that seemed to glow against the darkness and eyes that held a depth of sadness he had never encountered before. David pulled over and reached across to open the passenger door, immediately feeling the cold rush of wind and rain sweep into his warm car. The woman slid into the passenger seat with fluid grace, bringing with her the smell of rain and something else, something like old roses and earth. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft and melodic despite her obvious distress. "I didn't think anyone would stop." Up close, David was struck by how beautiful she was, but there was something unsettling about her presence that he couldn't quite place. Her skin was almost translucent in the dashboard light, and when she smiled at him, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the open door. "Where can I take you?" he asked, trying to shake off the strange feeling creeping up his spine. "Millbrook," she replied, naming a small town about 20 miles ahead. "I live there with my family." As David put the car in drive, he noticed she hadn't put on her seatbelt, but before he could mention it, she was already gazing out the window with an expression of profound melancholy. The conversation that followed was unlike any David had ever experienced. The woman, who introduced herself as Sarah, spoke in a dreamy, distant manner that made him wonder if she was in shock from being caught in the storm. She mentioned details about Millbrook that seemed oddly outdated, talking about places and people as if the town hadn't changed in decades. When David mentioned the new shopping center that had been built there 5 years ago, Sarah looked confused and insisted there was no such place. Her responses became increasingly disconnected from reality, and David began to worry that she might have suffered some kind of head injury. She spoke about her family waiting for her, about how worried they must be, but when he asked for their phone number so he could call ahead, she claimed they didn't have a phone. In the 21st century, this seemed impossible, but Sarah's earnest expression suggested she truly believed what she was saying. The temperature in the car seemed to drop several degrees, and David found himself constantly adjusting the heater, unable to shake the persistent chill that had settled over him. When they finally reached Millbrook, Sarah directed him to a quiet residential street lined with old Victorian houses. The storm had begun to subside, but the rain still fell steadily, creating halos around the streetlights. "This is it," she said, pointing to a house that looked like it had seen better days. The paint was peeling, and the yard was overgrown with weeds, giving the place an abandoned feel despite the warm light glowing in the windows. As Sarah prepared to leave, she reached into a small purse that David hadn't noticed before and pulled out a delicate silver locket. "I want you to have this," she said, pressing it into his palm, "as a thank you for your kindness." The locket was surprisingly cold and felt heavier than it should have. Before David could protest or even get a good look at it, Sarah was out of the car and walking toward the house. "Wait!" he called after her, but she didn't turn back. He watched as she approached the front door, which seemed to open before she even reached it, swallowing her into the warm light beyond. David sat there for several minutes, staring at the house and turning the locket over in his hands, before finally driving away with a profound sense of unease. Back home, David couldn't stop thinking about his strange passenger. The locket lay on his kitchen table, its silver surface reflecting the overhead light in ways that seemed to create patterns and shadows that weren't really there. Upon closer inspection, he could see it was an antique piece, beautifully crafted with intricate engravings that depicted roses and thorns intertwined around the edges. Inside, he discovered a small photograph of a young woman who looked remarkably like Sarah, but the picture had the sepia tone and formal pose characteristic of photographs from many decades ago. The name Sarah Catherine Mills was engraved in flowing script on the back of the locket, along with dates that made David's blood run cold, 1954 to 1973. The mathematics was simple but impossible. If these dates were correct, Sarah had been dead for over 40 years. David tried to rationalize what he had seen, telling himself it was just a coincidence, perhaps a family heirloom passed down through generations. But deep in his heart, he knew something supernatural had occurred on that storm-swept road. Unable to let the mystery rest, David spent the following day researching Sarah Catherine Mills. The local library's newspaper archives revealed a tragic story that sent shivers down his spine. On October 15, 1973, Sarah Mills, age 19, had been killed in a car accident during a severe thunderstorm. According to the report, she had been walking home from her job at the local diner when she was struck by a vehicle that had skidded off the rain-slicked road. The accident had occurred on the exact stretch of highway where David had picked her up, and Sarah had been trying to get home to the very house on Elm Street where he had dropped her off. The newspaper photograph showed a young woman who was unmistakably the same person who had sat in his passenger seat just 24 hours earlier. David discovered that Sarah had been wearing a white dress on the night she died, the same dress she had worn in his car. The article mentioned that her family had searched for days for a silver locket that Sarah always wore, believing it had been lost in the accident. That locket now sat on David's table, as real and solid as anything else in his possession. 3 days after the encounter, David's landline phone rang at exactly 3:17 a.m., jarring him from a restless sleep. The caller ID showed only static, and when he answered, he heard the familiar soft voice that had haunted his thoughts since that stormy night. "David?" Sarah's voice came through the line, distant and ethereal, as if she were calling from somewhere very far away. "I wanted to thank you again for helping me get home. I've been trying to get home for so long." The line crackled with interference, and David could hear what sounded like rain in the background. along with something else. Voices, multiple voices, all speaking at once but too faint to understand. "Sarah, is that really you?" he managed to ask, his voice trembling. "How are you calling me?" There was a long pause before she responded. "Time isn't the same here, David. Past and present, they blend together like watercolors in the rain. I've been walking that road for 40 years, waiting for someone kind enough to take me home." The line went quiet for a moment before Sarah's voice returned, fainter now. "Keep the locket safe. It's the only thing that connects me to who I used to be." The next morning, David drove back to Elm Street, the silver locket clutched tightly in his hand. What he found there defied all logic and reason. The house where he had dropped Sarah off stood before him, but it was clearly abandoned and had been for many years. The windows were boarded up, the porch was sagging, and a for sale sign in the front yard was so weathered that the text was barely legible. Weeds and vines had completely overtaken the property, and the mailbox hung at an awkward angle, rust consuming most of its surface. David approached an elderly neighbor who was working in his garden and asked about the house. The man, who introduced himself as Frank Pemberton, explained that the Mills family had lived there decades ago, but after their daughter Sarah died in that terrible accident, they couldn't bear to stay. "They moved away within a year," Frank said, shaking his head sadly. "The house has been empty ever since. Strange thing is, people sometimes report seeing lights in the windows or a young woman in white walking up to the front door, but that's just folks' imaginations running wild." David stared at the abandoned house, remembering clearly how Sarah had walked up that very path and how the door had opened to welcome her into the warm, inviting interior he had seen that night. Weeks passed, and David found himself returning again and again to that stretch of highway, the silver locket always in his pocket. He had tried to donate it to the local historical society, thinking it belonged in a museum, but each time he attempted to part with it, something stopped him. The locket had become warm to the touch during his phone conversation with Sarah, and sometimes, late at night, he could swear he heard a faint heartbeat emanating from within its silver confines. David began to realize that some mysteries are not meant to be solved. Some encounters transcend the boundaries of our understanding, and some souls remain tethered to this world by bonds stronger than death itself. He never saw Sarah again, but on stormy nights, when the rain pounds against his windows and the thunder shakes his house, David sometimes hears his phone ring at 3:17 a.m. He doesn't answer anymore, understanding that some conversations belong to a realm beyond his comprehension. The silver locket remains in his possession, a tangible link to an impossible encounter that changed his perspective on life, death, and the mysteries that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we can never truly understand. And sometimes, just sometimes, when he drives past that lonely stretch of road on stormy nights, David catches a glimpse of a figure in white standing by the roadside, thumb extended, still trying to find her way home through the endless rain of eternity.